Well, while we're waiting, I'll just say welcome to all the students. I was a professor for many years. I've been emeritus retired status for God since 1995. What is that? Coming up on 28 years this summer. And so I don't teach that much. And it's fun to do this and have Bill ask the questions so I don't have to prepare a talk.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, Marty, we're all inspired by your work. I think the minute you see the beauty of the Diffie-Hellman method, then you're totally hooked on cryptography and building a more secure world. So I'd like to wind right back to your youth, and you were born in New York. Sorry, where are you just now? Where in the world?
I'm in California at the Stanford campus. I'm on the Stanford campus. It's affectionately known as the faculty ghetto. I'm sitting at the desk. In fact, when you mentioned Diffie-Hellman, I'm almost certain this is the desk where I came up with that algorithm late one night in, I think, May 1976. My wife buys good furniture, so it's still, I live on orange crates. I was born in Manhattan, but I grew up in the Bronx.
Yeah. And your father, I think, was a physicist.
He was a physics teacher, as was his younger brother by 2 years, my uncle, who taught me physics, in fact, at Bronx High School of Science.
Yeah. And so do you think that was always the route? You were always going to take a more hard science route into education?
When I was in 3rd grade and we were studying the explorers, so I was in New York City, so we were studying Henry Hudson and people like that. I remember I desperately wanted to be an explorer, but I knew that I had to be a scientist. Don't tell me how I knew that at 8 years old. And my wife, Dorothy, has pointed out to me that I have become an explorer. It's just not a geographical explorer.
Yeah. And then I think you did a degree, a master's degree, and then a PhD in electrical engineering.
That master's and PhD all in electrical engineering, correct?
Yeah. I did electrical engineering. I followed my father and my grandfather and so on. What made you go into that rather than physics and maths?
Probably ham radio. My father was a ham radio operator starting in the 1920s. He was born in 1908. And his younger brother, Charles, who was my physics teacher at Bronx Science, and by the way, the reason for that wasn't nepotism. I took physics in my junior year, and they had an enriched course that only he taught. And fortunately, I was helping the other students pass the class, so they didn't object to him giving me a good grade. But I became a ham radio operator when I was about 16 years old, and that got me thinking of electrical engineering.
And in your early career, you obviously graduated and you went to work in the IBM Research Center. I think it was around 1968.
Correct, 1969. I was at IBM.
And it was such an amazing place. I think they created SQL there. They obviously had their research in System 360 and so on. And they created the DES cipher. And I think you had contact with Horst.
Yeah, so I was hired in 1968, and Horst Feistel, who's the father of IBM's work in this area, in many ways, unclassified research and cryptography, although he originally came from MITRE Corporation, where he did classified work. Horst was in the same department as I was, although I didn't work on cryptography, but he taught me some things and showed me some things that really was key in getting me interested in cryptography.
Yeah. Why was IBM invested so heavily in research? Because they were a computer manufacturer at the time. They had virtually a monopoly in the market. What was it so special about cryptography that they wanted to get into?
Well, as I understood it, they saw time-sharing systems coming up. TSS was the IBM time-sharing system. Multics was at MIT. And I think they were concerned about how your data and my data might coexist in the same computer, and I shouldn't have access to yours or you to mine, and they wanted encryption. But IBM was also an early player in the ATM market, and so they may have been thinking in that direction, automated teller machines.
Yeah, because I think one of the first adopters were Lloyds Bank in the UK, and I think it eventually was used in the finance market. So I wonder if IBM were also thinking about the change in finance and the move towards digitization and storing data.
Yeah, also I have a joke when people ask me what got me interested in cryptography. I only half jokingly say, just like there's a muse who whispers in poets' ears, I say, just like there's a muse who whispers in poets' ears. There's a muse who whispers in mathematicians' ears and everybody else's ears. But nobody pays much attention to her because the ideas are so crazy. Like I remember talking with Horst, in fact, about public key cryptography in maybe 1975, before we had the Diffie-Hellman algorithm, and we just had a concept. And I had trouble convincing him that it was possible. Now, admittedly, I only had 10 minutes before he had to go to a doctor's appointment, but it flew in the face of the conventional wisdom because Kirchhoffs, as you know, in the 1870s enunciated a number of principles for good cryptographic systems. And one of them was that all of the secrecy should reside, all of the security should reside in the secrecy of the key. So how can you have a public key crypto system? And what people missed is that you could have part of the key public and part of the key secret, public key and a secret key.
It's amazing. And I think you and Whit were quite critical of DES at the time. What was your thoughts?
Well, initially we thought it was a mistake. We thought that it was a bug because DES had a 56-bit key. On paper, it looked like 64 bits, which was more understandable. But one of the first things they did in the algorithm was throw away 8 bits on the pretense that they were parity bits, which is ridiculous because they used a lot of parity bits. I won't go into the details. So Whit and I wrote a letter to the National Bureau of Standards, as was then called, now NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, saying, hey, you should increase the key size because it was cheap to do that and easy. And they answered all our other objections, but not that one. And after about 6 months, we realized that it wasn't a bug, it was a feature, not from our point of view, but from NSA's point of view, because NSA did not want a publicly available crypto system they could not break. And so that became one of the first, half of the first crypto war, as I call it. And the government won that one because DES became a standard with the 56-bit key, although we had recommended triple encryption to effectively double the size of the key. Why you had to do triple encryption, I won't go into.
Triple encryption, we do that in the class, and it's always quite funny to show encryption, decryption, encryption, and then it's quite magical when you actually see if you have the same key, then
it becomes single DES. Yeah,
with DES, it's quite clever, but such an overhead, and it's still around. I mean, it still could be used if possible. So I think from 1969-70, you were an academic at MIT, and then you moved on to Stanford, 1971.
Came back to Stanford, right? Because I did my graduate work here.
That's right, and you retired so early. I think 1996. Why did you retire so early?
I don't fully know. I was 50 years old, but I started teaching when I was 23, so I had 27 years of teaching under my belt. And at the time, I thought, I didn't know why I had, but there was a powerful inner force in me that said retire. Basically the job I used to love. I used to even love making up exams because I would find questions that would teach something or a homework problem. And I had to force myself to do that. I still enjoyed the magic lessons, as I call them, which is the teaching, how you add up a bunch of sine waves and get a square wave, things like that, or cryptography. But it was clear that there was an internal force in me saying, slow down. And at first I thought it was because my wife's health was getting worse, which now fortunately is better. And I was needed at home to help take care of her. And it would have been very difficult if I was going a mile a minute. But then what I've realized more recently, and I still don't fully understand, is I needed to slow down. I'd been going a mile a minute, and I needed to slow down for myself. We're supposed to be human beings, not human doings. And early in my life, I was a human doing. And that's okay. It worked out well. But it was time to be a human being for a while.
That's amazing. I think that's quite inspirational for anyone. Just now in academia, they may love the environment, but the workloads can be horrendous, and they're losing what it is they love about the job because it's just so swamped with other things, and it becomes a bit of a game where you had the opportunity to really create things that were so impactful, and the thinking time was so important.
Yeah, I actually didn't mind working hard, but I knew I ruined my marriage in doing that. That's a whole nother story.
And in '79, you created one of the most amazing papers in computer science ever, the New Directions papers.
That's actually 1976.
76, yeah, 76. Sorry, the patent I think was
Mid-77,
even a little bit later. So 76, it's unbelievable. Yeah, that's the Martin Gardner article, I think, was about 1970.
The Martin Gardner article may have been 1977 because that was based on both us and RSA, and their paper was in their report was in 77.
Yeah, that's amazing. Martin Gardner was so inspirational. I think I read most of his books, most of his math. He brought mathematics alive. He was a magician, I think, but also a mathematician, and the way he wrote was so amazing. And it was obviously him that brought the RSA method and your method to the public. You didn't ever meet him or had any?
No, I don't think I did meet him. I think we probably corresponded by snail mail in those days, if anything. But no, I don't think I never met him.
Yeah. So what do you remember about the paper? What was the creative process that actually made the magic happen, and what impact did it have at the time?
So Jim Massey, who is a famous information theorist, now deceased, taught at Notre Dame and then at ETH in Zurich. Jim invited me to write a paper for the IEEE Transactions on Information Theory, of which he was the editor, on cryptography. And this was before we had Diffie-Hellman. But maybe we had the idea of public key cryptography, or maybe not even that. And so I asked if Whit could be the co-author, because he and I were working so closely together. And Jim said, fine. And then we went through several iterations on this. And finally, in May 1976, as I told you, working, I think, at this very desk, I came up with the Diffie-Hellman algorithm. We finally had a workable system. And I included it in a talk I gave at Ronneby, Sweden, the IEEE Information Theory Symposium. And Jim was there. I mean, all the top information theorists were there. And Jim told me, if you get that result in the paper, I'll have it in the November issue of the Transactions. Now, this was June. That's an unheard of short publication delay. And it did make it in the November issue, although, as Whit is fond of pointing out, the November issue did not reach people till January or February of 1977. So in a way, you were right with the year. So that's how that came about. And it was really Whit and my meeting, I think, that was key. We met in the fall of 1974. Whit had been traveling around the country, interested in cryptography. He'd left the AI lab where he worked here at Stanford under John McCarthy, because he wanted to do more cryptography than they could support. And the AI community has a kind of underground where, if you're part of that inner circle, you can bunk in people's homes. Like John McCarthy had a high school student living in his attic up the hill from me. So Whit was able to live on a relatively small amount of money. He met his first girlfriend, then wife, Mary Fisher, who has since died, and whom he credits with being a major influence in his life. And he stopped at IBM Research in Yorktown. And I'd been there maybe 3 months before. And Tuckman and the other people, Tuckman was head of the math research group and the cryptography research group. Walt Tuckman told me, I can't tell you very much because the secrecy order had come down on IBM. And they told Whit roughly the same thing, but they told him one more thing. When you get back out to Stanford, look up Hellman. He was talking the same crazy way that you were. And so Whit gave me a call and set up a half-hour meeting or something like that. And it ended 11 o'clock that night because there was such a meeting of the minds.
Yeah, that's amazing. And did you know at the time there was a little back door and even the middle?
No,
I suppose
this was the fall of 1974 that we met. And DES wasn't announced until March 1975, roughly 6 months later. Yeah. So no, we'd already been working when that came up.
Yeah. As far as I can tell, the classic patents that really built the security of the internet were published around the end of the 80s. At the end of the 1970s, we then went into the privacy and signatures in the 80s. So you had Feistel publishing the DES paper. There was the Diffie-Hellman-Merkle paper, which is obviously the Diffie-Hellman method, and then there was the Hellman-Merkle paper.
Well, also the Merkel's puzzle method. So actually, Ralph Merkle doesn't get the credit he deserves. He invented half of public key cryptography, the privacy part, independently of Whit and me at UC Berkeley when he was an undergraduate and a master's student. And his, just as I told you, our paper got this very quick publication review from June to November. I mean, Jim Massey said, get me that, write that in the paper and I'll get it in. Similarly, when I got the RSA paper to review for ACM, I got a letter from the editor saying, please review this as quickly as possible because it may be the most important paper we ever published. And you never get letters like that. Yeah. Whereas Ralph's paper was rejected by the ACM because he didn't, part of it was the one reviewer that they got was from the, I believe, from the classified area. And he in fact said in his letter, of which I have a copy, that this paper is not in the mainstream of cryptographic research. I recommend it be rejected. It was not in the mainstream. And the editor even wrote, it bothers me that you have no references. Has nobody thought of doing anything like this before? And the answer was no. And Ralph actually came up with his idea, the puzzle method, a little before we even had our concept, but we didn't know about it. And then we joined forces. But because Whit and I were already working on the invited paper and Ralph had already submitted his paper, we published separately, which is why his name doesn't get associated with it as much as it should.
Yeah, and there's obviously this, I forget what Niall Colbitz calls it, but there's this builder and attacker mentality in cryptography. You build it and then someone knocks it down. It's just part of cryptography. And obviously the knapsack patent and the knapsack paper must have seemed that was going to be the solution. And then Audie Shamir came along and knocked it down. Shamir was always a great knocker down of things, and he didn't manage to knock down RSA. So what can you remember about that time when knapsack looked as if it was a great potential for public key and then for it to all fall down?
Well, I have a neat story about it. I was at maybe the first crypto conference or the second crypto conference in Santa Barbara about 1980, 1981. And Adi Shamir had come up with his method, and Len Adelman of the A of RSA had programmed it up on an Apple II computer, which gives you the idea of the time frame. And he started off his talk. I was sitting in the front row, and everybody knew he was going to try to break the trapdoor knapsack, which Ralph and I had published. And he generated a random key, and as he talked, it was supposed to be computing it. And so he starts off the talk by saying, first the talk and then the public humiliation. And I remember being chagrined and thinking to myself, I didn't say it, but why do you have to say that? Everybody, including Adi Shamir, has had systems that have been broken, that they've come up with. Well, what it turned out Len meant was he was afraid the computer was going to crash and he was going to be humiliated. And so it just goes to show that we need to be careful and ask more questions. One of the things Dorothy and I say in our book on creating true love at home and peace on the planet, one of the sound bites is get curious, not furious. And so with Len Adelman in 1980 or 81, I got not quite furious, but kind of mildly furious. Instead of saying, wait a minute, what do you mean by that, Len? Of course, I couldn't ask him without interrupting the talk. But we need to ask more questions. We make a lot of mistakes by forming assumptions that are not necessarily, that are not valid, which we don't even see as assumptions. We just see them as self-evident truths, axioms.
Yeah, and you see that just now. So I think the Kyber key exchange method for post-quantum has been approved by NIST. That's a great step forward. And it's gone to standardization, and now you see the media saying it's been cracked. It's not been cracked. All that's happened is there's a side channel attack on it. It's not finalized in its approach. So I think sometimes the media goes very quickly and grabs onto things. There was the Chinese paper that broke RSA and they didn't even use quantum methods. So do you think the media is sometimes a bit naive?
They didn't break RSA, did they?
No, they didn't. No, I think
that's how the media. That's how the media phrased it.
That's how the media. Yeah,
this is the problem. The media likes to sensationalize things, and so we need to be careful. What do we really know? And we need to do that, particularly before we go killing people or helping others kill people. We were talking just before this about Vietnam, and I was playing a little bit of a Lyndon Johnson clip from the Johnson Library, so I know its provenance is valid. And this is there were two Gulf of Tonkin incidents, which became the basis for the Vietnam War, the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. And the first one was portrayed as unprovoked aggression on the high seas. North Vietnamese PT boats attacked an American destroyer. Well, except you hear in this that the day after, Johnson's talking to a friend in a telephone conversation that was recorded, now declassified, saying, well, we were blowing up roads and bridges in that area in North Vietnam in covert operations, and I suppose they wanted to put a stop to it, not unprovoked aggression. He doesn't say that. But so they fired on us and we sunk them. And the second attack, which occurred the day after, has a simpler explanation. A formerly top secret NSA history of the event says no attack happened that night. I won't go into the details of why we thought it did and why it was played up because that fit the government narrative.
That's interesting. And Peter Snorr published a patent using his method. And perhaps he slowed down innovation because of that patent. And it's only now that we see Klaus Peter Snorr, that's right. And he published the patent. And I think only now DSA is being approved by NIST, but we've spent decades not being able to advance some of the methods. But David Kravitz obviously published the DSA patent based on discrete logs and Elgamal. We'll come back on to here in a little minute. And he assigned that to the USA. And we were obviously free to use the digital signature method. So as someone who published amazing patents, what's your feelings about them now? Do they stop innovation, or are they a valid way for universities and academics to protect their IP?
Both. It's very rarely one or the other. In fact, Dorothy has an expression, the big and, because sometimes we'll have disagreements. Is it this way or is it that way? And then she'll sometimes say, maybe it's the big and. Maybe there's some truth in each of those. And so patents serve useful purposes and they also impede progress. And it's hard to say on balance where we should be, but this is the system we've got. It's the one we play with.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. In the UK today, they're talking about that universities should only take 10% of spin out companies, because I think universities have maybe taken a little too much in the past. If
they take too much, then the people won't be motivated to make it work.
That's
I think MIT had roughly 15% of RSA. Wow. And that's what motivated Jim Bidzos, who was the president of RSA, I assume that's what motivated him to make it into such a powerhouse.
Yeah, I suppose. And so you worked with WIT. So what was it about you and WIT that made it such an amazing team? What was the brains? You see, many papers are a mixture of different people. The R, the S, and the A were all different types of people, and they came together and they created the magic. What was the magic between you and him that created such a foundation?
Well, first of all, I should say there was magic for a few years, and then it got old very quickly. WIT has what I would describe as an authority complex, and I'm a year younger than he is. I was a professor. He had a bachelor's degree from MIT in mathematics, nothing else. And so I had the position and the credibility, and so it got a little bit old. And actually, it was good that he went out on his own. He needed to do that. And then, especially with the Turing Award, we've reconnected and in a very positive way. And I've asked myself a question that I often ask when somebody can be a pain in the ass to me, as I was to WIT and he was to me at times. Is my life better off for having known WIT, or am I worse off? And there's no question that my life is better off for having known WIT. And so I appreciate him, and you have to appreciate all of him, not just the pieces you want. You can't change people. Like I had this realization about my wife just the other night. I mean, we haven't had a fight in almost 20 years. We were on the verge of divorce 40 years ago. How did that happen? That's the story in the book. And I think you have the links for all these things that you can send to the students so they can download a free copy of the book and listen to various talks I've given to the Nobel laureates 3-4 years ago. But so let's see, your question was, what was the magic? I've said, let's see, Whit has said that he is more creative than I am, but I am better at coming up with results. And I don't know that that's fully true, but there's some truth to that. He came up with ideas, and it was actually the reverse of the usual thing. Usually the professor has the ideas and the students with all the time do the hard work to come to show that it's possible or carry it through to completion. In our case, I was the one who did the hard work. Like on the DES key size issue, Whit was the first one to realize the problem, but then he didn't do much with it. And I went over to the Integrated Circuits Lab and actually wrote most of the paper that is the joint paper of Whit and me on in the IEEE Computer magazine on exhaustive cryptanalysis of DES. So it's kind of a funny relationship. The other thing, the ACM Turing Award video that features the two of us, they start off with something, I didn't say this in the very beginning, but they get to edit it and move things around. It starts off with me saying, many people say that Whit was my student, but Whit can be nobody's student. And that's very true. So it was an amazing time, amazing thing, amazing combination. And then we went our separate ways, and now we've come back together again in many ways.
Yeah, I think it's well known. I think Professor Mary Hill at Harvard talks about this challenging and slightly abrasive environment to make sure that you can have dialogue. It doesn't do any good to just agree with everything. So building a team, it's important to have that critique of each other. So obviously the magic worked and the paper was created. So you looked after, yeah.
There's one other thing. Everyone else said we were crazy. And so I think that helped push us together.
Yeah.
And by the way, I'm very proud of being a fool. Dorothy was doing tarot readings, tarot cards about 35 years ago. And I said to her, why are you doing those silly cards? We don't believe in that stuff. And she said, I had a fear of it, which she picked up from our culture, because the church, even though she never went to church, the church has this thing that that anything that was not of the church that had any mystical qualities was of the devil. And so I think she picked that up through our culture. And she said, what she said to me, and I admire this in her, is I decided if I was going to be afraid of it, I should see what it was first, because she had no idea what tarot was. So she said, would you like me to do your reading? So she does the cards. I said, sure. And I end up the fool. And I didn't say it, but I was not happy. I wanted to say, but did not. I'm a world-renowned Stanford professor. I hadn't yet won the Turing Award, but that was coming. And Dorothy points out to me, and I think this is part of the power of tarot, is that it takes things that are usually seen as negatives, like the fool or death, and it shows you the positive side of it. And she pointed out that the fool goes where no one else goes. And all of a sudden, I realized that this was the key to my success in the technical world. Yeah. And it's been the key to my success in other parts of life, because as we say in the on the book jacket of our book, following Dorothy down a path that even she could not fully describe was even more foolish than pursuing cryptography. And yet the rewards were even greater. Even $1 million, which is what the Turing Award is worth, can't buy true love.
Yeah. That's amazing. I think it's great that people can actually see that they think you're wrong and what you're doing is wrong, and the best way to overcome that is to prove them wrong eventually. And you obviously did that. So you looked after.
Another thing, yeah. Hold open the possibility that I may be wrong. I've been wrong on a number of things in life, and this ego, where we have to prove ourselves right. In fact, one of my daughters has a friend, or an acquaintance, not a friend, who says he will defend his position even when he knows it's wrong, even if it's been later proved wrong, because he has to defend his brand. That is the problem in life. We need to admit our mistakes. This is how we make advances. This is how we move forward as a species, as individuals.
Yeah. And you looked after so many of the great PhD students. Ralph Merkle was one, the boy genius, who as an undergraduate came up with public key encryption, as you say, He submitted research papers that were rejected because they had no references, but he came up with the Merkle tree, a 5-page patent that outlined the Merkle tree, which is now the core part of blockchain.
Oh, yeah. So yes, the Merkle tree is separate from the puzzle method for public key encryption, but Merkle trees have been widely used. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So what happened there was,
what
happened, so there's a nice story there. Ralph was in CS 244 at Berkeley in the fall of 1974. And he actually sent me the paper, the typewritten page. He had to do a term project. And so he proposed 2 projects, the first of which was developing public key cryptography, basically, and the second of which I don't even remember, was much more mundane. And the professor wrote, and we have this scanned in blue ink on the top of the paper, that idea number 2, the more mundane one, looks better than idea number 1, possibly because your explanation of idea number 1 is so muddled, which it was in the professor's defense. But Ralph dropped the course and developed public key cryptography on part of public key cryptography on his own. But no one at Berkeley appreciated him. So I said to him, why don't you come down to Stanford and do your PhD when you finish your master's with me? And Ralph said, I can't afford it. And I pointed out to him that I could give him a research assistantship that would pay as much money to him as he was getting as a TA at Berkeley. The tuition was covered by the RA. So he came here and did his PhD.
Yeah, that's amazing. And Stephen Pollock was obviously now departed, unfortunately. And he was involved in a lot of the early explanation ciphers and so on. What was his core contribution in cryptography?
Well, we were looking at discrete logarithms. We called them indices because John Gill, who's another unsung hero of public key cryptography, and by the way, one of the first Black graduates of Georgia Tech, neighbor and good friend of mine. Yeah. I went to John because he had a PhD in mathematics from Berkeley under Manuel Blum, who's usually in CS and now I think at Carnegie Mellon and retired. So I went to John probably 1973, 74. I said, John, you know more math than I do. I'm looking for functions that are easy to compute and hard to invert, the simplest cryptographic function, one-way functions. What would you suggest? The first thing John suggested was, one of the first things was integer factorization, which we'd already looked at, and we did not see how to make it into RSA because we did not even have public key cryptography yet. And so I said, no, we've looked at that we haven't seen how to use that. And then he said, what about indices, which are what mathematicians call discrete logarithms? And that became the basis for Diffie-Hellman and RSA, really. And the work that Steve Pollock did, who you just mentioned, who unfortunately died fairly early, about 5 or so years ago. And Steve and I had a paper, which is basically the RSA system, except it's a conventional crypto system, but it's done mod P, modulo a prime number, instead of mod N. And we looked at doing it mod N, but discarded that because it was more complicated. And I now believe that that's because we had not at that point even come up with the concept of public key cryptography, and we didn't come back to it.
Yeah, that's right.
It
was seen as a private key system because you couldn't obviously release the prime number. So obviously RSA came along and made the public modulus. So we spoke to Tahir, and he obviously told us all about his work that he had with you and how you mentored him. And the thing he said was that when he first started, he says, you said to him, here's 12 problems that are not solvable at the current time, go and investigate them. So he found one, obviously. What a genius. He did that, and the Elgamal method is now being used in zero knowledge proofs. Can you remember what the other 11 were?
And I don't remember what the other 11 were, but in his thesis, so first of all, I didn't mentor Tahir that much because I was getting involved in international security at that time. And so I did help Tahir, but he did almost everything independently. He was amazing. Also, his older brother, half-brother, Abbas Al-Gamal, who you probably know, but not all your students do, was chairman of our department here. So Abbas had been a student and then later came on the faculty here after, I think, teaching at USC. And Abbas was amazing. And then his younger brother comes. And how often is the younger brother as good as the older brother? In this case, they were both fantastic. But one of the things Tahir did was he used Gaussian integers for factorization of numbers of a specialized form, much faster than could be done. And this was one of the key ideas that led to the number field sieve, I've been told by people who worked on it. So he did a lot of things. But the thing he's best known for is the digital signature algorithm, the Schnorr variant of the Elgamal signature scheme, which was the first public key standard.
Right. And he didn't patent it at all?
No, actually, he came to me and he said, do you think I should patent this? And I said, well, we patented our things and we actually made almost no money from our patents.
No money.
RSA sold their company for $250 million. I was kind of pissed at RSA for a while because they wouldn't pay royalties on our patents. I'm now good friends with them. That's a whole nother story. But so Tahir came to me and I said, it's up to you, but the patents get in the way of adoption and research, and they take time, and we haven't made any money, but maybe yours is different. And he said, no, I'm not going to patent it either. And that may be one of the reasons it probably helped for it becoming one of the standards, because there was no question of paying royalties.
I think that's very true. So the Schnorr signature method was held back, but the Elgamal method went through, and obviously the DSA signature method also went through. And I talked with Len Edelman, and he had a difficult time with RSA. He wasn't happy being in the business environment.
Oh, well, actually, RSA had Ravesh Shamir and Adelman formed RSA. Ron was leading it, and according to Jim Bidzos, nearly drove it into the ground financially. I mean, not drove it into the ground, but it was having financial difficulties. They brought Jim Bidzos in, and he, according to him, and I think this is true, you have to watch it when people say things that are declarations in interest, but Jim was an amazing businessman, is an amazing businessman.
Yeah. And I think you also worked with the Marconi Prize winners, Jim Clark and Paul Katcher. What was their role in creating a secure internet?
Paul Katcher.
Katcher, yeah, Paul Katcher. What was their role?
You're talking about Tahir. So Tahir was chief scientist at Netscape in this time frame. And he sent me an email, which I still have, I believe, saying, could you recommend a student to help me with some cryptographic work? And I recommended Paul Katcher, who I think was either still an undergraduate majoring in biology, not computer science, or had just gotten his degree, and that's all he has. He does it without benefit of clergy, is the way I put it. He's one of the most brilliant, most productive information security people around. And so Tahir was developing SSL3, which in modified form became TLS. And Paul developed the cryptographic primitives, for which the two of them, Elgamal and Katcher, received the Marconi Prize about 2 years ago, maybe 3, I'd have to check.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think when I spoke to you last time, you talked about James Simmons, who was a mathematician.
Jim Simons.
Simons.
Let's see, it's two people. There's Jim Simons, who founded Renaissance Technologies, and there's Gustavus Simmons at Sandia. Which one are you thinking of? Because I think
it's James, who was the mathematician who then created the hedge fund.
Hedge fund, Renaissance. Yeah, so Jim, the story I've heard, which I haven't checked out, so with that caveat, he was working at NSA North, which was in Princeton, New Jersey. I forget the name of the institute there. And during the Vietnam War, the story I've heard is that he decided he was anti-war and he refused to do classified research, so they fired him. And he went to Stony Brook, part of SUNY, State University of New York, where he became chairman of the math department. But he founded Renaissance Technologies. And coincidentally, a kid I went to junior high and high school with, Henry Laufer, now, of course, not a kid. Henry Laufer was head and shoulders above me in mathematics. I remember in junior high school, the math teacher at one point gave back our exams and said, well, Marty, you finally beat Henry. Not that I ever was trying, because there was no point. Henry was just brilliant. By the time we finished high school, he'd finished all the undergraduate math requirements for his BS degree. And he finished college in 2 years and his PhD at Princeton in 2 years. And Henry was Jim Simons' right-hand man at Renaissance Technologies. And Henry's now worth $4 billion, according to Wikipedia, last time I looked, and Jim is worth even more, I'm sure. So Jim founded Renaissance Technologies, and Jim Omura, who also plays a role in this, I haven't gone into him, he also helped with Renaissance Technologies, and Elwin Burlkamp, also a good friend of mine, now departed. So it's kind of funny how the whole thing works. And what seems bad, like getting fired by the equivalent of NSA, turns out to be a really positive thing.
Yeah. And we spoke to Niall Koblitz, one of the creators of elliptic curve cryptography, and I think he's still a professor at the University of Washington. And he was if you read his book, he was very anti-war when he was younger, and he had that spirit against some of the things that were happening in Vietnam. And you see quite a few people in cryptography who have that anti-establishment approach. David Cham is in the news today, still pushing forward privacy methods and very much an anti-establishment figure. Is there something about the community that makes them like that? They try to be independent and not stand with the government on some things?
Well, first of all, I would prefer to pose us, instead of as anti-establishment, we are pro-evolution, pro-change. And I think that it takes someone questioning the conventional wisdom. And if you question the conventional wisdom, I think if humanity makes it for another 50 to 100 years, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren will look back, just like we look back on dueling, and wonder how human beings could have been so primitive as to feel they needed to fight duels to prove their manhood. We will look back, and they will look back and wonder how we could have been so uncivilized as to have fought wars as ways to resolve international conflicts instead of sitting down and trying to understand each other's viewpoints. A former Secretary of Defense, who remained nameless since I don't have permission to quote him, who I was talking with maybe 3 or 4 years ago about North Korea and Iran, said we need to recognize their legitimate security interests, which they do have some, so that they can't bring their illegitimate security interests to the table. And the same is true of every nation where we have conflicts. Like right now, we think that Russia has no legitimate security interests in Eastern Europe. Well, why does the United States have sanctions on Cuba? How would we respond if Mexico were to form an anti-American, pro-Chinese military alliance, the equivalent of NATO to Russia? And so this doesn't mean that we also don't. So we need to look at Russia's legitimate security interests, but we also need to look at Ukraine's legitimate security interests. We need to find a way to work this out, because right now war empowers the most hardline elements, the most vicious elements on both sides. Like Putin has neo-Nazis fighting for him in the Wagner group, and some of the Azov battalion or Azov regiment that was defending Mariupol for the Ukrainians had Nazi roots. Although I've talked to some people that question how much of the Nazi ideology is still present in Azov. But that was one reason that Russia was so intent on smashing Mariupol and the Azovstal steelworks, which wasn't covered in the Western media very much. We don't like to cover that. I did speak to one of the 40 American congressmen who 4 years ago tried to get the Azov battalion, as it was then known, declared a foreign terrorist organization because of its Nazi roots and the way it was operating. And what he told me soon after the Russian invasion is we need to put that aside for now, because the Azov battalion regiment are the best fighters that Ukraine has. Well, we need to not put that aside. We need to recognize that Ukraine has legitimate security interests, Russia has legitimate security interests, and how are we going to work this out in a way that balances those and doesn't empower the worst elements on both sides?
Yeah, that's interesting. And obviously the conflict, you've been staunchly anti-nuclear weapons, and it looked like things were settling down.
I'm pro-life, not anti-nuclear. I don't like to be anti-anything. It's got to be, what are we for? That's excellent. There's so many people that say no to things and to be negative. And actually, one of the things that I say is, if I had a magic wand that can make nuclear weapons disappear tomorrow, I don't think I would wave it, because it wouldn't do any good. First of all, we'd reconstitute our arsenals as quickly as we could. What we need to do is trace the problem back. Nuclear weapons, climate change, all of those, we were talking about AI, like the bots. All of these are symptoms of a deeper underlying problem. They're not the real problem. The underlying problem is that technology has given human beings godlike physical power. In the Bible, only God was supposed to be able to throw down thunderbolts that could destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. Today, we call them nuclear weapons. Only God was supposed to be able to create new life forms. We're doing it routinely in the laboratory. Only God was supposed to be able to create a flood that, in the myth of Noah, would necessitate Noah building an ark, whereas climate change threatens that today. So the real problem is the chasm between our godlike physical power through technology and our at best irresponsible and often terrible twos behavior as a species. We'll never be godlike in our maturity level, but we need to become at least responsible adults where we think through the consequences of our actions, which we're not now doing.
And you think the home, the family, is probably the place that we can start to build a better world?
Oh, that's how I did. That's when I made the transition from cryptography to international security. The intermediate step, and it actually was really the first step, was marital security. Life with me was so impossible 40 years ago that my wife had thought of leaving me, which I didn't know because, as I said, I was so busy, I had blinders on, I didn't even know this. But she went looking for catalysts. She decided she wasn't going to do that. And she found a group which no longer exists that worked on the international, the macro, and the micro at the same time. And what we say in our book, which people can download a free PDF from my website if they want to see it, the subtitle is Creating True Love at Home and Peace on the Planet, that I can't point to one nuclear weapon that I've eliminated. I can't point to one war that that helped avert. But my life is better every day because I don't fight with my wife. We haven't had a fight in almost 20 years, which was beyond my comprehension. I grew up in the New York Jewish culture, the Woody Allen movie type thing, where people are constantly going at it. And I kept saying to Dorothy, what the hell do you want from me? And now I know she wanted to bring a piece of heaven down to earth, but I couldn't even envision it. And so, yes, that's the place to start, because that's where you see results immediately. I mean, it took us 20 years to get from the verge of divorce to not having had another fight. And we're continuing to evolve. It's not like we stopped there. But one reason we wrote the book is to speed that process up for other people. But people shouldn't expect that they're going to jump from where they are now to where they'd like to be. It takes a lot of work. And most of the problem is learning to love ourselves. The Bible says, love your neighbor as yourself. And the trouble is most people hate their neighbors the way they hate themselves. And if you find yourself kicking yourself, as I used to do after making a stupid mistake, I don't do that anymore. And that's part of what we have to learn to do, is to recognize their humanity. And by the way, I talk in terms of God, but even atheists can relate to the kind of God I'm talking about. If nature had wanted us to be angels, we would have been angels. We were made as fallible human beings. And so who are we to question whether that's where we should be? That's where we are. Let's move it forward. Let's evolve rather than beating ourselves up and beating up others.
And I know that you've been away from research in cryptography for a while, but obviously you maybe keep up to date with things. And obviously quantum computers are coming along. Who knows when they'll actually be built in production, and it will really destroy all of the public key encryption we've had for 40 or 50 years. What impact do you think that will have? Is that going to be bigger than the year 2000 millennium bug?
Well, the Y2K was nothing.
It's nothing, yeah.
So first of all, if this happens, because we don't know whether it will, I mean, there are people who have really studied this deeply who say it's a real, it's on the horizon, and other people deeply expert in it have told me, no, this is never going to happen. So I don't know which it is. But I do know that we need to not wait for the problem to surface its head, just like nuclear war. If you wait for it to surface its head, people who point to Ukraine and say, see, we've crossed all of Russia's red lines and nothing's happened. Well, that's no solace to me, because when we do cross it, it's too late. When we finally cross one that they're not going to give in on. And so if quantum computing breaks current public key cryptography, let's say even 50 years in the future, the students listening in are likely to still be alive. And their medical records that are protected today need to be protected 50 years in the future. So we need to be thinking about it now as well as when it happens, not just in the future.
And then in the news today, WhatsApp have been quoted to say if the UK goes ahead with their breaking of crypto, the breaking of the end-to-end tunnel, they're going to pull out of the UK. And I know that you've written some papers around this. What's your feelings around the tensions between the rights to protect society against the rights to protect privacy and using backdoors and so on?
It's, again, like, which is it? It's both. If the automobile had been invented in the classified literature, and the only people that had cars and were police and the military of the countries we like, you could see where there would be great upset if someone were to invent the automobile in the unclassified literature, because people would say, wait a minute, the criminals are going to get away. Right now we can catch them. But they wouldn't see ambulances and the ability to travel and all the other advantages that would come with cars. And the same is true of cryptography. And so we are in a transition period internationally. I mean, we still have nation states, we still have wars, and they're not going to go away anytime soon. But we need to start working toward a world, the kind of world we've always wanted, because nuclear weapons have made it not just morally desirable to beat swords into plowshares, they've made it essential for human survival. And most people don't recognize this. If we keep fighting wars, each one has some small chance of escalating. And Ukraine has actually a large chance of escalating. By large, I mean maybe 10% over the next year. That's too large for me. It's still small. Eventually, one of these is going to blow up. And so nuclear weapons are also the nuclear opportunity, forcing us to finally figure out how to avoid these conflicts, all of which are avoidable. I was just reading an article I told you before we came on that it's in the Washington Post this morning, and it's when Putin turned away from the West. And it's arguing, I think it was 2004 when the Beslan school massacre happened, when Chechen separatists attacked a school, killing over 300 people. And the West, and the United States in particular, had been aiding Chechen separatists. Although we saw them as moderates, the Russians saw them as terrorists. And there's a wonderful Israeli documentary that I've watched. It's called The Gatekeepers. And in it, they interview, I think, 7 out of 8, something like that, of the then living former heads of the Shin Bet, the Israeli internal terrorist organization. And one of them says at one point, and this is the one part that's in English, that's when I realized that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter.
Yeah, that's true. So are you optimistic or pessimistic about our future? Are we building a better world?
I'm optimistic, and for 2 reasons. One, my marriage gives me hope. I mean, it is a data point showing that what seems impossible is possible. But the other, Harry Rathbun, who was my mentor in this area, he was a man born in the 1890s, died in the 1980s. So I knew him in his later years in life. Harry was a professor at Stanford, and there's a lecture series named after him. And the last speaker was the Dalai Lama. The first speaker was Sandra Day O'Connor. Harry said there are 2 hypotheses regarding humanity's capabilities. The nobler hypothesis is that humanity is capable of the radical changes required in this technological age. He said this in the 1980s. The less noble hypothesis is that we're doomed. If we accept the less noble hypothesis, we're doomed even if we had the capacity for change. If we assume the noble hypothesis, the worst that happens is we go down fighting, and the best that happens is we survive, where pessimists would say we have no choice. So Harry said, and he always had a twinkle in his eye when he said this, why not assume the noble hypothesis? Why not be an optimist?
Yeah, that's a great way to end our talk. Thank you so much, Marty. It's been really inspirational to chat with you.